Good afternoon and welcome to the Cartoon Art Museum. My name is Nina. I'm the program coordinator here. And I'm really excited about this beautiful location. We were able to bring Rob Rogers out to our beautiful new location to talk to you about his work and his new book, Enemy of the People, which we will have available for purchase and signing just across the way after the talk is over. But let's get straight to it. So Rob Rogers is a political cartoonist who's been on staff at the Pittsburgh Press for 9 years and 25 years at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. He's also a two-time, starting this year, is the second-time Pulitzer finalist. Ooh. So give him a round.
There's no money with that one, though. I mean,
prestige stuff.
No, I'm kidding.
He was also the president of the Toonseum in Pittsburgh, which the Cartoon Art Museum used to trade shows with all the time. So he's been a long-time friend and fan and supporter of us as well, and we couldn't be happier to have him here. So without further ado, Rob Rogers.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks everybody for coming out on such a nice sunny day. I want to say hello to the Facebook Live friends who are watching, because I'll be standing back there, so they won't see me the rest of the time. But yeah, this is great. Let me ask you, how many read a daily newspaper? I know there aren't many left, newspapers, I mean, and there's probably not a lot of readers. But so where do you get most of your news? On the internet, I guess? Yeah, online or from cable news? Hey, good to see you.
Nice to see you.
Always late, of course.
Always late. Nice. But then I wasn't expecting you to be here at that line.
You didn't figure I'd get to be on time.
Yeah, right.
So what I'm going to, there are very few newspapers left in the country, so it's kind of sad. After I left the paper, they went down to 5 days a week, so now they're not even a daily newspaper. There's no daily newspaper in Pittsburgh, and so that's happening more and more in cities, and I think it's kind of tragic. But there are new ways to get your information, and that's what we're going to talk about later. But I will begin with some slides to show you kind of what's been happening with me, and explain a little bit about my cartoons. So sit back, enjoy the show, and then we'll open it up later for some question and answer, and I'll also do some drawing for you on the overhead. Okay, so one of the things that I was doing a recent interview and talking about having lost my job, and the reporter said, "Well, why should we care? It's just a cartoon." He was trying to be provocative, obviously, but that got me to thinking. It is just a cartoon, and it is sort of like, should we really worry about that and care about it? And I think we should, But I started to think, well, editorial cartooning and satire, political satire, has such a history in this country that it goes all the way back to actually the birth of this country, and even back to this is actually Boss Tweed's comment about Thomas Nast's cartoon. So we'll start with him because he's probably the most famous American cartoonist in terms of having a real effect on his targets. So this is Boss Tweed. He was the Democratic powerhouse. He ruled over Tammany Hall, and they were very corrupt. And there you can see Thomas Nast drew them as vultures, and the corpse underneath is labeled New York, and then there's the New York Treasury, and the law, and the renters. And so it was very... He used to draw, Thomas Nast used to draw Boss Tweed all the time. And so what Tweed said was that, his constituents can't read, it's them damn pictures that he's like upset with. So, and the story is that, this is another one of his cartoons. The story is that finally the corruption caught up with him and he was arrested and jailed. But he escaped jail and fled to Spain, and somebody on the street recognized him from one of the cartoons that Thomas Nast had drawn. So So that shows you the power of the cartoon, and he was extradited and brought back to prison. But so I do think that that cartoons are important. But back to the founding of the country. This is Ben Franklin and Paul Revere. Paul Revere, it's hard to see him; he's in the dark over there. But you obviously know what these guys did for the birth of the country and for our revolution. But you may not have known that they're both political cartoonists. So here is Ben Franklin's Join or Die cartoon. This one's very famous, and it has all of the colonies listed there, sort of encouraging them to join in the revolution to stand up against Britain. And then Paul Revere drew this cartoon about the Boston Massacre, and it also had the same effect in terms of helping to energize the colonists against the tyranny of the king. So just keep that in mind, that that it went all the way back to the founding of the country. Now you jump forward a few centuries, and you have somebody like Herblock for the Washington Post, and he coined the phrase Mccarthyism, which is no small deal, but that's still with us today. People say that all the time. He also gave this guy a hard time. That's Nixon. I am not a crook. He was drawing Nixon even before he was president, so it was he was kind of a regular target. And then you have people like Paul Conrad, who also drew vicious cartoons about Nixon, to the point that Conrad ended up on Nixon's enemies list, which is kind of remarkable for a cartoonist. But so there you go. So basically that's just to show you that it's not just a cartoon. It has impact. It has import in our history and in satire in general. And so I think that's something to keep in mind. As we consider the fate of journalism and the fate of cartoons. So I'm going to go back. For those of you who know, I was fired in June of last year for drawing cartoons that were unflattering of the president. And the reason that's so unusual, and the reason I was shocked by it, and the reason that the public was shocked by it, is because I've drawn the last 6 presidents. And so I'm going to start out with some of the early ones. You can see my style has changed a little bit, but this is Reagan in his second term, or actually this was 84, so he was running for his second term. But he created a program called that he called Star Wars, that was supposed to sort of knock down the nukes before they ever got to the U.S. And the Russians were nervous about it. So I did a cartoon of him obviously drawn like Luke Skywalker, or dressed like Luke Skywalker, and he's saying, he's agreed to meet with you, but he won't wear the costume. Here's another cartoon of Reagan. This is back in '86, when the Iran-Contra scandal came to light and Congress was investigating it. And I was kind of proud of myself with this cartoon because I managed to combine 3 different metaphors. So the first one you notice is it's the Gong Show, right, from the old TV show. And then I also used the old Dr. Pepper commercial where he's saying, I'm a Contra, he's a Contra, she's a Contra, we're a Contra, wouldn't you like to be a Contra too? And I guess 2 metaphors, I'm sorry, I got 2 things in there. But then of course it's about the scandal as well, and Reagan dancing. Next was George H.W. Bush, number 41, and of course we were all surprised when he picked Dan Quayle as his vice president. And when Bush got sick and was in the hospital, everybody got scared, like, oh, what if something really serious happened to him? Well, look who we'd end up with. So here he is thinking, I've got to slow down. This is George Bush on taxes. See, that's what's fun about doing it in the slideshow. You can't get that effect in the paper. It's very static. And then, of course, he was followed by none other than Bill Clinton and Hillary. They're both in the raft, the Whitewater real estate deal, and Bill's saying, funny, there's nothing in the brochure about this part, dear. And they're going off. Then, of course, they were the first ones to try health care, and the Republicans were equally as adamant about not letting them get anywhere with it. So here's the president saying, health care reform is not over till the fat lady sings, me, 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 me. She's warming up. And then, of course, Clinton, I did draw critical cartoons of Clinton as well. And he, especially during the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and here he is saying, did I mention the economy is doing great? And of course, people were very upset. But people did like Clinton because we had a strong economy. So here's a guy just saying, hey, would it be possible to just impeach him from the waist down? Which I think they should have done. That would have been better. Next came George W. Bush. Now this is not an actual cartoon. This is an illustration that I put together where I took heads from the different cartoons that I've drawn of him over the years, just to show you how my caricature developed. So this is an early one from when he was running for president, July of 1999. Oh, it's called The Evolution of the Ears, because, as you may know, many cartoonists drew his ears very big. They stuck out a little bit, but they certainly weren't huge. But we all sort of went there with it. This is November 99. His ears are getting a little bit bigger. His eyebrows, his eyes are closer together. Here he is, May of 2000, and the eyes are a little smaller, the ears are bigger, and then finally, here's January of 2001. He's got two little dots for eyes, and then here's the way I drew him the rest of the time. That's pretty much it. And what's funny about a caricature of a president is that sometimes people may not look at it and say that looks exactly like the president, but they start to recognize your caricature, and so they start to look for that face, and they recognize it just from your drawing, from seeing it in the paper every day. Here he is saying, you no longer have to live under the iron-fisted regime of the evil Saddam. We're here to liberate you. Mistakes were made. Mistakes were made. Mission accomplished. So, this is what's interesting about, Trump nowadays. He apologizes for nothing and doesn't admit any mistakes. And even Nixon and Reagan admitted mistakes. And I would say even W probably admitted a few, but not back then. He wasn't ready. Then, of course, came Obama. And this was a cartoon I drew after the 2010 midterm election when the Tea Party was swept into office, and and he called it a midterm shellacking. And so here he is saying, I had a hard time communicating my message. What did he say? He said he's a hardline communist messiah. Pretty much how some people look at him today. But no, this was when bin Laden was finally caught and killed, or found and killed. They didn't really have a chance to capture him, but I decided to use the old, Wizard of Oz with the Wicked Witch of the West under the house there. And so, I don't know if you remember the movie, the guy comes out with a proclamation and reads it. And so I actually looked up the video before drawing the cartoon to find it, to get the exact wording. And so here he is, he's saying, he's not only nearly dead, he's really most sincerely dead. And then you have a birther down in the corner there saying, I'm going to need to see a death certificate. Because, they don't believe anything he says. And then, of course, we all liked Obama, but we knew what was coming next here, passing of the torch. Yeah. So, all right. So then I'll talk a little bit about how the creative process works and how I come up with ideas. Normally, I sit down, I read the paper, I watch the news, I try to write down ideas or write down topics at least and try to figure out what's going to be the best thing for me to draw that day. And that's usually the way it goes. It usually takes the first half of the day. If I can get an idea sort of written out by lunchtime, I'm in good shape. But there have been a couple of rare instances where something in the news just immediately hits me and I think of an idea. And here's a couple examples. This was when Benjamin Netanyahu was speaking before the United Nations, and he was telling he was warning everybody about Iran's nuclear capabilities. And what was funny about it, and I found this picture on the internet, but what struck me as humorous was what he brought with him. He brought a cartoon of a bomb with him. And I saw him sort of pointing at, he had a red line there at the 90%, really trying to scare people. The color doesn't show up as well on this slide, but it's a red line. And I looked at it and I said, well, that reminds me of every cartoon bomb that I saw on Saturday morning cartoons. So of course I immediately thought, oh, I've got to do something with Warner Brothers. So here we have Ahmadinejad, and he's pointing at the Acme bomb, saying, okay, who leaked our nuclear bomb design to Netanyahu? And there, of course, is the guilty one in the corner there, over on the edge there, Wile E. Coyote. And then this was a story about Dick Cheney, and he refused to call their interrogation techniques torture and said they were perfectly legal and very American. And when I heard that, I thought, well, what about all the liberty that we talk about, And so I thought of the Statue of Liberty, and I thought, oh, well, maybe I'll draw Cheney as the Statue of Liberty, the new Statue of Liberty. So here he is. And I had fun drawing him in the fishnets, and bring us your huddled masses yearning to be waterboarded. So those are rare days when those ideas just pop up. Normally it works like this. I have a sketchbook. I write down a list of ideas. Now this was an old sketchbook, so this was back from 2004 in February, and it says, I have listed there Groundhog's Day, WMD Intelligence, Janet Jackson's wardrobe malfunction, because it was right after the Super Bowl, and then gay marriage in Massachusetts was another topic. So what I did was I combined the first two topics there, the Groundhog's Day and the WMD, and I came up with an idea for a sketch. That's the rough sketch in my sketchbook, and then here's the finished, and I'll give you a closer look at it. But it was George W. Bush, and he's just shot Punxsutawney Phil, and he's saying, I was wrong about him having weapons of mass destruction, but he was still a threat. Because nobody likes 6 more weeks of winter. So that's kind of how things happen on a normal day with the sketchbook. Now, once I get a cartoon idea, I still, at least in the old days when I had a staff job, I used to have to still pass it by the editor. And as you might guess, an editor and a cartoonist think very differently. And so one year they asked me to do an illustration for the back of an editor's magazine, and this is what I came up with. I came up with the editor's brain versus the cartoonist brain. So we'll start with the cartoonist brain. The largest thing on a cartoonist's mind, of course, is toilet humor. We're obsessed with it. And then winning a Pulitzer, keeping his or her job, and then that tiny, tiny little part of the cartoonist brain that is taste. And that compared to the editor's brain, he's thinking about a lot more things like not offending the readers, keeping the publisher happy, winning a Pulitzer too, kissing up to advertisers, the bottom line, and then that tiny, tiny little part of the editor's brain that is sense of humor. So you can see they don't really match up very well. And so there was, in the beginning, especially with my very first editor, we had to kind of, figure each other out, and that took a little while. But then for the last 2 editors I had each of them for 12 years, and they were both incredibly smart and funny, and they were able to work with me. They understood what I wanted to do, and that changed when they brought in the final editor, but we'll talk about that later. Okay, so the process. I just put in some slides here that I did for an exhibition, which was sort of a little primer to sort of explain what kind of tools the cartoonist will use. So here it is. What does it take to create an editorial cartoon? And this was in 2016 during the campaign, so keep that in mind. Let me draw you a picture. Step 1, find a topic that begs for satire. And of course, this was during the campaign when this is a true story. They were on stage. The Republicans were on stage talking about penis size. They obviously were not talking about penis size outright, but they were. Anyway, step 2, choose the perfect metaphor. I can't draw genitals in a family newspaper, but hands are okay. Things with small hands, baby, watch, T-Rex. Step 3, create a rough sketch using your favorite sketching tool. I don't recommend the fork. It doesn't really work well. Some cartoonists sketch with a pen. This is the actual sketch out of my sketchbook here. Some use a pencil. And some use a tablet. You can't see it there because the slide's dark, but it's Etch-a-Sketch. And step 4, transfer the sketch using light table or some other form of black magic. I still use a light table and I still ink my cartoons by hand. Some cartoonists are totally digital now. Step 5, ink the cartoon using your inking tool of choice. Step 6, add color, either by hand or digitally. So I do add my color with the computer. So I do ink it in first, but then I scan it and put the color in later. Step 7, stand back and watch as readers react to your brilliance. I don't get it. Give it a sec. I still don't get it. Give it another sec. I don't have all day. So there you can see sort of the 3 stages. The one in the middle is the ink the final ink cartoon, and then I scan that in and add the color, as you can see on the
And that
end.
appears to be you.
What's that? What appears to be me?
Is that you?
Oh yeah, that's supposed to be a caricature of me, of course, yeah. So here, what I'm going to do is, since we're talking about the campaign, I'm going to show you a few cartoons from my campaign, or from the campaign, not my campaign, but my cartoons from the campaign. And I'll start with that one. So this is a bigger version of it. So Trump is obviously stomped over things like stability and tolerance and unity. And he's saying, my small hands don't seem to be slowing me down at all. Here's Ted Cruz getting into the race, and most people just throw their hat in the ring, Senator Cruz. Here's the Bush dynasty. You have Jeb and W and George H.W., and he's saying, read my lips, I am my own man, mission accomplished. Game of Thrones 2016, there's Hillary in the Iron Throne. For those of you who are fans of the show, she's saying, this isn't a coronation. I want my minions to see me as a candidate of the people. Well, you can start by not calling them minions. The many faces of Bernie Sanders. Here we have him angry at Wall Street, sad about the prison system, disappointed with Obama, surprised by grassroots support, giddy over free college, and ecstatic about New Hampshire. I still can't ever see him. I never see him smile. So, this was after Trump won the primary, and you know how he gives nicknames to everybody. So I came up with some nicknames for his opponents as well. You have Ground Carson, Lion Ted T-Bone, Jed Baloney, Christy Prime Rib, Fiorina Flank, and Rubio Ribeye. And there's Trump saying, "Let the healing begin." And this was the final debate with Hillary, where he was stalking her, if you remember. He sort of would creep in behind her when she was on camera. And some people they said the bar was so low for Trump that some people even said he won the debate. I don't think he did, but here they are watching, and the woman says, "Hillary didn't end war or cure cancer. She clearly lost. Trump didn't grope her on stage. He won." So what I'm going to do is show you, this is about 4 months before I was fired, and it was about a month before the new editor came in, and this was just a random week that I wanted to show to just give you a sense of what my cartoons look like in any given week. So this would have been Tuesday's cartoon. Budget deficits are a mortal sin. They will inflict unthinkable pain and suffering on our poor grandkids. They will trigger the coming apocalypse. On the other hand, and this was when they had just passed tax reform. Well, it was basically tax cuts for the rich, not reform. But then I did a local state cartoon for the gerrymander, Pennsylvania, and the Supreme Court says we have to redraw it, but it's a work of art. And that was also the week of the Winter Olympics. And so here's a guy saying, "One Korea, isn't that a bit naive? You mean like United States?" I like that. It wasn't quite a laugh. It was like it's like Frankenstein's in the audience. You know? I like that. This is a local. You won't understand this, but this is a local comic that I did every week. But just to give a sense of what I was working on. So that's the mayor, and I had it was always set in the diner. Just so they could come in and have coffee and talk with the waitress. And here he is saying he's breaking out the confetti for a victory parade. Is it about the sun coming out 2 days in a row? Because Pittsburgh's really overcast all the time, so that's the joke. And he says, no, it's Act 47 is over. And Act 47 was the state oversight because we went into debt as a city. And are you kidding? No more state oversight, no more restrictions. We can spend what we want on wages and pensions and crumbling infrastructure until we're back under Act 47. You think I should temper my exuberance? Just a bit. Okay, no confetti. So there you go. So that's a local one, and people like seeing the mayor, and actually one of the things that happened was later the mayor, when I was fired, the mayor tweeted a tweet that said, you know, he makes fun of me, he draws me, 10 pounds heavier, and all of this, and he criticizes me, but I think that, Rob Rogers cartoons are essential for this city. So he was a big defender, even though I made fun of him a lot. Trump's shelter for men battered by accusations of harassment, groping, and domestic abuse. This was when Rob Porter left the White House. Somebody has to defend due process. And of course, Trump's the poster boy. The same week of the Parkland shooting, so I did this cartoon. As American as baseball, apple pie, mass shootings, and failed leadership. So some cartoons obviously are meant to be serious and not all. They're not all funny. That's part of the job as a political cartoonist. So that was a week, just sort of an average week. And this is some more cartoons about Donald Trump. And I think somebody's phone is going off. Is that yours? Oh, it's gone now. Okay, there you go. Still going on. These are cartoons that I actually got in the paper. So for 2 years, of the Trump presidency, I was actually drawing cartoons, and they were getting in because my publisher didn't have the wherewithal to kill them, but this was when it was clear that Trump was going to be tweeting most of his presidency. Early in 2017, I do this, and of course the little Twitter undermining his credibility. Here we have Russian chess pieces: Queen, Queen, Bishop, Knight, Rook, and Pawn. Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. This was right after Comey was fired. And you would be... And this is Trump saying, see, I told you I'd build a wall. El Nino. This is because Trump was clearly, he basically tore up the climate report. He doesn't believe in science, so I figured, if he's going to act that childish, I'll draw him as a baby storm, with his little Twitter rattle there. This was after Charlottesville, and when he sided with the racists, saying there are good people on both sides. I just thought of all the civil rights movements and all the standing together and marching and being beaten and all of that, and then I thought, yeah, there really aren't two sides. So this was after the devastating hurricane in Puerto Rico, and Trump really didn't respond at all. He was playing golf during that time, and then he eventually went there and tossed them some paper towels, but they are still hurting, and he has not done enough for the country, or for the island. You're an unhinged, childish nuclear despot with insane hair. I know you are, but what am I? Korea. It's almost too easy. And this was one I did about the Mueller investigation that I thought was it just made sense with it. And I was a kid when this movie came out, and I remember going to the beach to watch it. I was in New Jersey for the summer, and I saw it. And then, of course, I didn't want to go in the water after that. But here's the Mueller as the shark coming up on it. Okay, so let's talk about why I'm here. Killed cartoons. So every political cartoonist that's ever drawn a cartoon, or for an editor or a publisher, knows that it's the nature of the business that some of them are going to be killed, because it's our job to sort of be provocative and to push the boundaries. And so it normally happens that, at least for me, 1 or 2 cartoons a year would be killed. Oftentimes they revolved around topics of religion or something else that was more controversial. This is an example. So Pittsburgh is a very Catholic city, so anytime I would approach a cartoon about the pedophile scandal in the church, I would get some pushback. This was one that I drew during the Boston pedophile scandal, and they were still searching for Osama bin Laden. And could you turn off your phone, please? Yeah. Could you turn off your phone? Oh, could you silence it? Could you just silence it? Thank you. So this was during the time that the Boston pedophile scandal was happening, and they were still searching for Osama bin Laden. And so here he is saying, "I heard this was a good place for evildoers to hide." And I thought this was a good cartoon, but the publisher said no. This cartoon was actually slated to run. It was in 2010 that I drew this. It was about Pope Benedict, and he was ignoring what was happening with the Irish pedophile scandal during that week of Easter. And so this was supposed to run on Good Friday. So you can see why it might not have. Here's the bishop, and he's saying, it's the annual hiding of the pedophile priests. There you go. They've got all the eggs in the basket there. But the interesting thing was, at first they said okay, and they had it on the page, and then they killed it later in the day. So it still went out for syndication, and this cartoon actually ended up as the top cartoon in USA Today a week later. So that was kind of nice. I was glad that it actually got some play. This is just one that I like that I did about the Pope, and they actually ran this one. So this was when the Pope, when they first started the Vatican Twitter account. Here he is saying, "OMG, this 21st century technology is great for spreading my 15th century views on gays, women, and contraception. LOL." And then, of course, my favorite part, hashtag say 10 Hail Marys. But I thought it was just funny that, just because he was sort of you think of the Pope as sort of this old guy out of touch, playing with technology. But anyway, those were cartoons that all, this one was in the paper, but the previous 2 were killed. So those are the kinds of things that would be killed during a normal year. But when the Post-Gazette hired a new editor, the publisher installed a new guy that was my boss, and his name was Keith Burris, and it was in March of 2018 when he came in. And in the 3 months that he was my editor, now remember, keep in mind I usually have 1 or 2 a year killed, but in the 3 months that he was my editor, I had 18 cartoons killed. And that's not counting the ones that I had to change or adjust or fix to try to make it work. Because I did that. I mean, they claimed that I wasn't willing to compromise, but I was. I didn't want to compromise my integrity, of course, but I was willing to change the cartoon or do a different topic. But 18 is just incredible. Now this is the first one of a week of cartoons that were killed. So right before this was Memorial Day weekend, and this was the first of 6 in a row that were killed. This is the new NFL penalties. This was when the NFL decided, okay, no, we're not going to let anybody kneel anymore. So here it is, and Trump was obviously tweeting about that a lot. Flagrant disrespect of the troops. and prompted unnecessary rough tweets from Trump. So these are the new penalties from the NFL. This one was killed. The next day I drew this one for Memorial Day. It was supposed to run Memorial Day. And it's got Trump laying the wreath instead of the Tomb of the Unknown. He's laying it at Truth, Honor, and Rule of Law. And this one I kind of figured I'd get some pushback on, but I thought they might still run it because it's Memorial Day, but they didn't. So then I came back after Memorial Day, and this was when the Starbucks was doing their they closed down for a day to do racial sensitivity training, and I figured, well, let's compare that to the NFL that closed for racial ignorance training, because they were basically supporting Trump's notion that kneeling was somehow unpatriotic and that it wasn't supporting the troops, which to me was just ignoring what it was really about, which was young black people being killed in the streets. So that was that cartoon. Oh, before I show you that one, so the next day Roseanne Barr is fired from her show for racist tweets, and so the first cartoon I drew for that was a sketch that showed, it was 2 panels, and it showed a couple watching TV. You couldn't see what was on the TV, but the husband is saying, despite the racist tweets, I do think this sitcom gives us an honest look at a divided America. And then the next panel, you see that actually they're looking at Trump, and he's tweeting, and the woman says, "This isn't a sitcom, honey." And so that was that. But they killed that one. That's a sketch, and it's in the book. But they killed that one. So then I was frustrated because they killed 3 in a row, and they killed my first sketch. And then I was like, well, I don't know what to do. And then of course Roseanne comes out and says, oh, maybe it was the Ambien that made me do that or say those things. So that's when I drew this, and it's just a guy in a doctor's office, and he's saying, could it be the Ambien? Or it could be Roseanne over there. Who knows? So the editor I was working with, Burris, who was killing all my cartoons, he said yes to this idea. He thought this was a great idea, and he put it on the page. But then later in the day, the publisher came out and said he didn't like it, and so he killed it. And so after that, it was 4 in a row, and I was really beside myself. Meanwhile, social media had started to pick up the story, and the readers were looking at it and seeing the cartoons that were in the paper, the ones in Pittsburgh, and they were seeing them on social media. So they were asking what's happening, and somebody else would say, oh, they're starting to kill his cartoons. So the media was calling me. I wasn't doing interviews yet, but they were calling me to ask me what was happening. I said, you'll have to talk to the publisher. I don't know what's happening. Yeah, and by the way we would communicate on these cartoons is, because I worked out of my home studio, which was just something they let me do 20 years before, so it was baked into the new deal. But what I would do is I would communicate by phone call or by email. So every morning I would send my idea to them with the email, and they would say yes or no. And usually it was, oh, that's really funny, or this is with my old editor. He would say, great cartoon, here, or you could change this word to make it a little punchier. So we had a good back and forth, and then I would sometimes call them to get more instruction. But with the new editor, I would just get this very terse no, and then I would write an email back saying, well, wait, why? This is why I drew it. This was the story. This is why I think it's important. And you give me some explanation of why it's not running. Nothing. So you have to understand that during this week, it's not that I wasn't trying to get an answer from them on why they were killing them. They just weren't talking to me, and I think it's because they were trying to manipulate me to draw cartoons that I didn't want to draw, that I couldn't draw, that I didn't believe in. So the next day I drew this cartoon, and they, of course, killed this because Trump is in it. This was about the separation of families at the border, and it's based, you guys know, we're in California, this is your sign, so I had to explain it to some people. They weren't familiar with the sign, and then finally that week, I drew this when he was pardoning everybody, including Scooter Libby and Jack Johnson. I just thought, well, he's sending a message to all those people that could testify against him. So he's probably got one of these things outside of his office. Didn't really think this was a very, biting cartoon, really. It was just sort of a statement of fact. And they said no, and they killed it. So after this cartoon didn't run, I took a week vacation to use so that I could, figure out what they were trying, like how we were going to negotiate through this. And I kept asking them to put me on the op-ed page. I said, if it's not working for you on the editorial page, move me to the op-ed page. Maybe, syndicate a more conservative cartoon in its place. But then that didn't work. And they instead what they did was they offered me a contract through the lawyer, but they didn't even meet with me themselves. They offered me a contract through the lawyer that was not very good. It laid out a bunch of criteria that I couldn't live with. So I said no. I said I'd like to just continue to do what I'm doing. I've been successful for 25 years. And so then, a week later, they offered me a severance package, which was equally as offensive as the contract. And so I said no to that, and I was fired. So, that's what severance is. Obviously, it's firing. So after I was fired, the New York Times called me immediately and said, "Hey, will you write about this for Sunday?" And I was fired on a Thursday, so I didn't have much time. But I did write a little story and I drew a little cartoon about it. And then a website called The Nib asked me to draw a cartoon about it, so I did that. And here's a little sampling of it. It's in the book, but I don't want to show you the whole thing because it would take too long. But Donald Trump cost me my job. You're fired. Okay, he didn't actually say that to me, but he might as well have. After 25 years as a political cartoonist for the Post-Gazette, I was fired in June for being too critical of President Trump. We're going to need your badge and your pen. I started my career at the Pittsburgh Press in 1984 when Reagan was running for his second term. And there you see I dipped my pen in Grecian formula to do his hair. The PG has always been a left-leaning paper. The publisher, John Robinson Block, pictured there, mostly kept his politics to himself. In 2015, that began to change. He was suddenly enamored with Trump and started hinting about a possible endorsement. What about the moral stands we've taken for decades? What do we know? JR began to push back on my cartoons about the Donald. Tell Rogers his cartoons don't capture Trump's intoxicating masculinity. And then my editorial page editor, who championed and defended me to management, took a buyout in 2016 rather than endorse Donald Trump. And there I am saying, I'm so alone. Curl up in fetal position. So you can see the rest of that story in the book if you get it, or online. But the main point here is that I feel like what's happening with newspapers and especially with the media is it's under threat right now from Washington and with this particular president. And I think it's easy to just sort of say, oh, that's just Trump, yelling at the media, calling them an enemy of the people. But I think it is very dangerous, and I think that it undercuts our democracy and it undercuts the freedoms that we stand for. And the Republicans are just letting them get away with it, So I think that's also dangerous. That's even more. In fact, that's even more. The part the Republicans are playing here to me is scarier than Trump himself because he's just one guy, and there is supposed to be checks and balances in our government. But anyway, I am still drawing for syndication. I started a Patreon page, which has been very nice and helpful, and fans can help support me that way. And then I've also been working on this book. So I'm very busy, in fact, busier than I was when I was full-time. But here's Trump. This is one of the cartoons I drew after the firing. He's saying, sign this non-disclosure agreement and I'll stop calling you the enemy of the people. And of course, this was referring to the non-disclosure agreement that he was offering to the porn star, but I figured, maybe if my publisher could see it, he'd understand what I was talking about too. It was a twofer. This one is especially near and dear to people here in San Francisco, but intentionally raised awareness about racial injustice. Unintentionally raised awareness about human sex trafficking. This is Bob Kraft of the Patriots. Grounded after 2 fatal crashes, still flying high after decades of countless fatalities. Oh, and this is a more recent one. This is Bill Barr, the Attorney General that Trump handpicked after he wrote him the love letter, 19 pages. And here's Barr jumping in front of him to block the Mueller report, and Trump is thinking, who needs the Secret Service? Oh, and then everybody's been let go, so here he is with Stephen Miller, the only one left to whisper into his ear. And then back to this, so when we think about some of the corruption that was happening during Thomas Nast's time, and when he was criticized by Boss Tweed for them damn pictures, just keep in mind, we may not have Boss Tweed, but we certainly have Boss Trump, and we have to fight against the corruption that's happening right now in Washington. So that's a bad slide there, but it's because the light's coming in the window, it's hard to see, but that's the cover of my book, and I will be happy to sign copies. But before we move on to the other room, I do want to open it up for questions, and while I'm answering some questions, I'm going to switch over to do some live drawing here. You want to do that?
Yeah,
Okay,
I'll switch it
you
over.
can switch it over. So I'll move into the front and just see if there's any questions. I'll sit my coffee here. Any questions about anything you've seen or about my working process? Yeah.
Are you still working in ink because you're selling your originals? I mean, is that part of your business?
No, I don't really sell very many original cartoons. I mean, occasionally somebody asks me for one, or they auction one off for charity, and that. But no, I have I have thousands of originals, and they're going to all go to either a museum like this, or there's one in Ohio that's the OSU Billy Ireland Library. It's probably where most of them wind up. But yeah, I think it's mostly because I still like the visceral feeling of drawing, and I'm old school. That's how I grew up. There weren't computers when I was a kid, and so if that had been the case, I might have more naturally gone to that. But it is kind of amazing to see what people can do with an iPad. I mean, I know there's a couple of cartoonists who are friends of mine who are equally as old as I am, but they decided to make the jump, and they're drawing the whole thing on the iPad. So it is kind of amazing. But I still like to have an original. I just kind of feels nice to be able to pull out an original and show somebody. Or when you have an exhibit, it's nice to have the digital color piece, like a print, and then you show the original ink, and you can see sort of the whiteout, or you can see what I changed in Photoshop, and it's kind of nice to see that too. Other questions? Yeah.
How did you feel after these newspapers and the cartoonists in Paris? Like, how did that feel as a political cartoonist when everything was happening?
Yeah, so the question was about the Charlie Hebdo shootings, right? And that felt really close to home. I mean, and especially, and also the newspaper in Maryland was also, a fellow journalist. So no, it really was tragic. And what was difficult was, when I draw something about a tragedy, it's usually somebody else. And it's almost always somebody else, because I'm still drawing, so it wouldn't have been about me. But that was, Charlie Hebdo was really tough, because these were cartoonists, and they went in and slaughtered cartoonists just for what they were drawing. Now, people asked me after that event, well, do you think that did you think they were drawing cartoons that you would draw? And that's not really the question. I mean, free speech has to be, free speech. It can't really be, you can't just say, well, only the things I like are allowed to be free speech. So the cartoons were a little bit different than what I would draw, and they probably went further than I would ever go. But I definitely think they had the right to do it, and they obviously had a point to make, certainly. So it was a real tragedy, and it did strike close to home, and I know all the cartoonists felt it viscerally, and we all had to draw something about it too. That was the other thing. So it was tough. But any other questions? Yes.
You draw cartoons about leaders.
Right.
What would you draw about the people changing?
Well, I do. I mean, some of the political cartoons I've drawn are about citizens, and about people and their viewpoints. I didn't show as many here just because of the topic that we're discussing, but in terms of what I would say, I think it's that couple looking at Obama, for instance. I mean, that's kind of where I bring the regular citizens into the cartoons and show them and how they're responding. I think that they could be better informed, and oftentimes better informed, but also sometimes the people are the pawns of these politicians, and so I do cartoons where I show them being victims, or show the people not being victims and speaking out. It just depends on what the topic is. I didn't know if you had a specific subject in mind, or just...
Well, the country seems to be getting much more fascist.
Right.
The world's getting much more
Yeah.
fascist. How are you going to be drawing them if in quotes, Trump wins the next election?
Am I going to be drawing the people that put him in office, you mean, as fascists? That's a tough one, but I definitely think I would be critical of people, and I am critical of the MAGA, supporters, his 30% or whatever it is. I mean, I do cartoons about them, but I also think that, again, it goes back to the Republicans, those people were always there. They were always a part of the fabric of America, right? But they weren't, but the leaders had enough intelligence and common sense to pass laws that would make it illegal to be, to lynch somebody, or, they passed laws. So even though that's a part of our fabric, I think it's still up to the Republicans in Congress and the Democrats in Congress to make sure that we're a country of freedoms and not a totalitarian rule. All right, with that, I'm going to move back here. You can still ask me a question, but I just want to do a little sketching for you. Just because people think it's fun, right? Okay, so one of the things that happens when you're drawing a caricature is, it's all about exaggeration, right? So with different people, you exaggerate different things. With Reagan, it was that dark hair and sort of he was sort of older and had the wrinkled face and everything else. But here, like with W, like I was saying, the caricature changed over time. But I got to the point where I could draw him pretty quickly. He had this nose that was sort of similar to the way I drew his father's nose. And the other thing was, it looks like kind of like a bird's beak, right? And then the funny thing was his mouth sort of echoed that same little downward point, So, and that's kind of how I ended up drawing it like that. And then, I don't remember what those lines are called, but the side. Yeah, labial fold. Thank you.
That was really official.
Yeah.
Spoken like an art student.
Or a medical doctor, right? Yeah. So yeah, and the hair, I sort of just have that a little bit unkempt, but not really, just sort of. And then, of course, the ears. And like I said, they started to grow, and pretty soon they were just kind of like, this is a little too exaggerated. But the other person that had big ears was Obama, and he even said he even made the mistake of saying early on, well, I have big ears, so the cartoonists are going to have fun with that. And of course, we did. Obama was tough because one of the things you have to worry about is when you're drawing, racial stereotypes. Obviously, we've gotten away from.
I have a question about
Yes.
W. Like, what made you decide to totally exaggerate his ears when they really weren't that much of a?
Sometimes it's a joint. It's like a joint phenomenon in the field of cartooning. So, for instance, I think that we all just started to draw his ears sticking out a little bit more each time, and they just kept getting bigger. And when you see one of your fellow cartoonists drawing him, with the ears sticking out, it's almost like a challenge. And, the other cartoonists say, well, I can make his ears stick out even more than that, And so pretty soon he looks like Dumbo, and he's flying around, Here, I'll draw him like Dumbo here. Yeah, poor Dumbo, I know, really. That's terrible. I shouldn't do that.
That's an insult for Dumbo for sure.
If I make clouds, you'll think he's in the sky. It's a little cartoon trick. So don't steal them. No, I think it is, and it's a similar thing is happening with Trump's hair and with his tie. I don't know if you noticed that, at first, because he does wear his ties super long, and somebody even took a photograph of. Nobody makes ties to be that long, right? So he shortens the inside part, and then he just tapes it on so that it doesn't stick out, right? And somebody took a photograph when the wind was blowing his tie, you could see the tape. And so that's how he gets them so long. Although I think he probably also now makes his own ties to make them longer. But they would be so long, and I think he thinks it's thinning, right? So that's what it is. But then the other thing is the hair, and the hair just has, it's so wispy and straw-like that I like to kind of draw it, looking very, wispy, but also not natural at all. So it's sort of, almost like he's taking some horse hair and a horse tail hair and
he's glue glued it to his
glued it on his head,
super glue, gorilla
Yeah.
glue.
Right.
That might be true, though.
And then the other thing people do is, Trump always looks like he's yelling at people. Like he never just talks, with a calm, expression. He always looks like he's yelling, even when he's saying things that he thinks are positive. It's just part of his thing. He's always at the, like at some sort of a Nazi rally, right? He's always like up in front, yelling about stuff. You should definitely watch the films of Hitler speaking and then watch Trump at one of his rallies. I mean, it is kind of uncanny. But and certainly he's, with all those burgers and Diet Cokes, he's not exactly svelte. So.
And what you should do is watch Mussolini.
Oh, Mussolini, yeah. Actually, that's probably a better. Yeah, you're right about that. And what I like, as a Pittsburgher, I especially like the fact that he's our first president with an actual mullet. Because mullets are big in Pittsburgh. But yeah, it's kind of funny, with his hair. The cartoon. I used to draw, as you saw from those early cartoons. Nobody really worked in color because the newspapers didn't have color availability, and so the black and white was sort of the thing. But so with his tie, I'll just kind of make it go up and around, and, all over, blowing in the wind.
May I ask a question about color since you brought it up?
Oh yeah. Well, what I was going to finish by saying is that. That it's nice to have color. Sometimes I feel like black and white is enough, but in the case of Trump's hair, the yellow really pops, and so it's such an unnatural color that it's nice to have that. And some people actually draw Trump with the bronzing, the orange face. I didn't start doing that because that was one of those ones like where I said, everybody else is drawing him as an orange-faced. I'll just keep him normal. But I make fun of them in other ways. So what were you going to ask about the color?
Well, you drew in black and white for so long and used what looked like Zipatone to put the grays in.
Mm-hmm.
When you're doing a cartoon now, are you still thinking of how it will work in black and white and then color it, or do you now draw?
Yes.
Okay. That answers.
I still draw in black and white first, and there's always a black and white version. Even these color cartoons that you see, there's a black and white version where there's a gray tone in the back. That then I change it to a blue tone for shadow. So oftentimes, but all the cross hatching and everything else that you saw in the cartoons, that's still there. So what I do is I do the black and white first, and I put in the shading and the shadows. and then I save that because the syndicate, there's still some clients that like to print in black and white, and so they need that copy as well. So some people just do everything in color and then they change it to a grayscale, but I never think that looks as good, in terms of the pop of
So you
black and white.
you want to work this out with the contrast
Yeah.
black and white.
Right, exactly. And then when I get to, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cover his face.
That's fine.
And then when I get to the to the color, sometimes I have to back off of a couple of things that I did on the black and white version, but it's usually a pretty simple process, just adding the color. Well, thank you very much.